Jane Arraf, welcome. Jane is a freelance NBC News correspondent, and before joining NBC, she was the Edward R. Murrow Press Fellow at the on Foreign Relations in New York. That followed her 8 years as CNN's Baghdad bureau chief, as well as Istanbul bureau chief and senior Baghdad correspondent. And Jane, I want to just sort of go right to that about your 2 years, or nearly so, as an embedded reporter in Iraq, and the mission of the journalist and the mission of the military, and where they overlap and where they conflict. And just share with us your thoughts on that.
Thanks. That is sort of an essential question, I suppose, and where they overlap, where you would hope they overlap, and sometimes they do, actually, oddly enough, is that I feel it's our job to go out there, take those risks, and come back, and if I'm doing television, show you what we've seen and put it in context so you can actually decide how it's going. It's not up to us to do that. Where those things don't overlap is that very often the military, with the exception of Colonel Baggio here, will feel that the reason journalists are there is to help them win the war. The reason journalists are there is to be cheerleaders for them. I've been asked to put on uniforms. I've been asked why we're not helping more with the war effort. And when I try to explain that as a longtime journalist, I feel that one is a journalist first and your nationality second, it's shocking to many of them. I'm not saying that everyone has to feel that way, but that is the way a lot of us feel. And it's a difficult thing to get across to young men and women who are out there risking their lives for various reasons. But there is still a big difference there between how we see ourselves and the job we should be doing and how the military sees us. Now, having said that, just again, very briefly, there are enlightened commanders, enlightened soldiers, non-commissioned officers who have made it possible for most of the reporting that you all would have seen from the war, whether it's the battle for Fallujah, the fall of Baghdad, and everything else. It can't be the only thing that you see. It can't be the only thing you use to decide how things are going, but it has been an essential part of being out there reporting on Baghdad and on Iraq in general.
Mike said that he wouldn't send anybody to Iraq, but you told me you think there should be more, not fewer, journalists in Iraq. Why is that?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. I think what Mike is saying is that he wouldn't send a journalism student or a recent journalism student to Iraq. Yeah.
Okay.
And I do think there has to be more reporting on Iraq simply because we're hearing fewer and fewer voices. And part of that is because there are fewer journalists. Part of it is because it's harder to get out there. It's become more dangerous. Part of it, I have to say, is because there is a feeling that the American public has tuned out. I don't know if you all realize how hard it is to get on air with an Iraq story, but, you know, get a Britney Spears story up there and we do not have a chance. And for all the talk that journalists only want to show bad news, in all the years that I've covered Iraq, and I've covered that war from the start, the stories that really get a lot of play are the ones with the most explosions. I covered the entire battle for Fallujah, live coverage, RPGs going off, mortars, very dramatic stuff. And then when it came time to rebuild Fallujah, and there were, I think, equally compelling stories with fewer explosions, there wasn't a whole lot of interest in seeing a family move back into their house and buy the bricks to build their house again.
Well, you mentioned all the years that you covered Iraq, but it wasn't just the war that brought you to Iraq. You were in Iraq for 15, 16 years, really. So when you return there, and you were most recently there in September, you return and see it almost, I'll say this, almost with Iraqi eyes. What is it like to be in Iraq today for someone who remembers it from 10, 15 years ago?
It's absolutely heartbreaking, and I think the longer that you've spent in Baghdad, the more heartbreak there is inherent in that. Heartbreaking because a lot of the people that I knew, are gone, whether they have left the country, whether they've died, whether they've had relatives killed. The cumulative effect of this war, and I think we're only coming to grips now with the effect that this war will have on America, but the effect in Iraq is that there has not really been a family that has been untouched. And in Baghdad, that means it's very difficult to find a family that has not lost a relative, that hasn't had somebody die in a sectarian killing or killed in a crossfire or died in some other way, or hasn't had their home confiscated, hasn't had something truly terrible happen to them. So I almost envy reporters who come in and see things with that fresh eye, where they don't know all the baggage that comes with looking around a city that you knew and seeing it destroyed and seeing the ghosts of people that you knew. But at the same time, I suppose what I'd like to see is more people who knew Baghdad and more Iraqis reporting. And, I have to say, I won't take too long, but I do think one of the positive things if there is a positive thing, of the danger and difficulty in Westerners reporting in Iraq is that it has produced a new generation of Iraqi journalists. And when I first went to Iraq, the only Iraqi journalist worked for the Iraqi government. And no one really believed that you could be an independent journalist who didn't work for some government. And now we're actually seeing them, and it's amazing, and they are incredibly courageous. And at some point, we are going to have to hand the torch even more to these Iraqi journalists, and that's how you're going to be able, and hopefully be able to get news about what really is going on in the places we can no longer go to.
Well, Jane, you mentioned the legacy for America of the war. And when one thinks of the Vietnam War, it had multiple legacies. It had a legacy for the media. It probably was the moment when a mistrust or a distrust or a questioning of the media began in earnest. Do you have any thoughts on what the legacy for the media will be of this conflict? Will it just be to completely end any sense that everyone doesn't have an agenda, or do people always question what it is you're up to?
I think one of the things I grapple with, and a lot of us grapple with, is the polarization of American society. And when it comes to how they see the news, how they evaluate the news, generally what I've found is that whether people believe my reports or not, and again, I've done a lot of live television. So the wonderful thing about live television is it's there, it's happening in real time, and it's hard to put a spin on it quite so much. But whether people believe it or not tends to be determined by what they think of the war. And I think that has been fueled partly because of the questions that we should have asked before the war, in the run-up to this war. And I think it's partly because of the rise of the internet and all those other things, the blogs, the fact that Americans who don't like what they're reading in their newspapers or seeing on TV can go onto the internet and find out what Sergeant Jones from Alabama thinks how the war is going. And all of that, I think, has fragmented what used to be a pretty cohesive viewership to the point where it's really harder not just to get people's attention, it's harder to get people to trust you.